Norman, thank you for joining us. Do you think this is a good idea in principle?
No, I don't. And we have in this country, some of the safest roads in the world. Successive governments have worked hard to get the death rate down on our roads. And in fact, even so, we have someone who is killed or seriously injured every 22 minutes on our roads. And there's a clear correlation between the speed at which vehicles go and the number of deaths which occur. Now, I'm speaking with some authority on this particular question because back in 2011, 2012, Philip Hammond and I, he was a Transport Secretary, looked at the whole issue of raising speed limits to 80 miles an hour on our roads. And what that in-depth analysis demonstrated was that the number of people dying on our roads would increase. And secondly, the amount of carbon emitted would increase by about 5%. So there wasn't really a reason to go down that route. And I think it'd be very dangerous to take the brake off, if you like, the reasonably good safety record we have on our roads, and this certainly would do so.
Why do you think Liz Truss is making that a point of interest? Because to me, I really wouldn't be bothered by either way. Why do you think she's sort of bringing that into play?
Well, to be honest with you, she was thrown a question by a member of the audience, and she gave an answer which I think she, frankly, couldn't have thought through. I mean, I happen to agree with her on one point yesterday, which is that so-called smart motorways aren't smart at all. They are very stupid motorways. And if we're going to get rid of those, that's a good step to take because that is dangerous for drivers. But, you know, we change these things at our peril. And we're moving towards a situation where speed limits are becoming more sensible in this country. We don't want to constrain the drivers unnecessarily. But, for example, in tight residential areas, not on main roads, then having 20-mile-per-hour limits is actually saving lives because a child that's hit at 20 will probably survive. A child hit at 30 will probably die. So the limits we've got in place across the country now are tried and tested and have got scientific base to them.
Although I read here that the German Road Safety Council did a study actually and indicated around 25% more deaths occurred on unrestricted sections of Autobahn. So it doesn't sound like it's that much safer. In fact, it sounds like it's slightly more dangerous. Do you think that there's some sort of onus on car manufacturers as well? Because they make cars that go 100, 120 miles an hour, 125. Well, what's the point of that if you can't really go any faster than 80 miles an hour?
Now, that's a very good question indeed, and one the manufacturers ought to answer. But, you know, what has happened over the recent years, particularly the last 20, 30 years, is cars have got a lot safer. You know, the idea of bags which emerge when you hit something and protect you, the idea of mandatory safety belts, these sorts of changes have reduced the death rate quite substantially. Cars now crumple, whereas old cars tend not to crumple and people go through the windscreen. So our cars have got better. Do you know, I'll give you an interesting statistic here. And I'll ask you a question, actually. Do you know the year in which most people died on the roads in car accidents?
1971.
Amazingly, it was 1926.
Really?
And 1926, when there was hardly any cars on the road, when cars were deeply unsafe, when nobody knew how to drive properly, when there were no speed limits, people didn't have licenses. That's what happened when you have a free-for-all. Let's not go back to anything like that.
Well, I think the main thing there is you said they didn't have licenses, which I think would be a problem. But you did raise one point, though, that is of interest. That you said that the cars are safer, which is why there are fewer accidents. So if they're safer, and then why shouldn't the speed limit sort of be extended in some respect? Would you consider them maybe increasing the speed limit to, say, 100 or something like that?
No, I don't. Well, there aren't fewer accidents. What there are fewer deaths and fewer serious injuries. The number of accidents hasn't necessarily gone down, but they are far more slight injuries now as a consequence of the design of cars. So, no, I wouldn't be in favour of increasing it. And I just want to mention climate change. I know you had that report a moment ago on Extinction Rebellion, and for the avoidance of doubt, I've got no sympathy with people who behave in that way. But ultimately, we do have a climate problem here. It's not the only problem we've got. There's cost of living and everything else. But we do have a climate problem. Just look at the temperatures we had over 100 degrees Fahrenheit across a couple of months ago in this country. Look at the fires raging around the world. Look at the floods in Pakistan, which are climate-related. So we can't ignore that situation. And the fact is, increasing speed limits, as we demonstrated by the Department for Transport's analysis back in 2011, 2012, increasing speed limit to 80 on motorways would increase carbon emissions from road transport by about 5%. Now, carbon emissions from road transport have actually not gone down very much. Energy emissions have gone down substantially as we move towards renewable energy and energy efficiency, but transport emissions having gone down, and they all by and large are on the roads, because rail, for example, generates only 1.5% of transport emissions in carbon terms. By and large, the rest is roads.
Well, I mean, I suppose that is true if you believe that carbon is the reason why the climate is changing. Norman Baker, thank you very much. He's the former MP for the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Transport.